So my first question is, your version of Catherine and Henry's story gives a lot of context to what we learn in the history books. Basically, we're learning what we didn't learn.
Hmm.
Do you think that this has made Henry like a little more, not necessarily forgivable, but more human and more understood than what we've learned?
Yeah, I think for us, both of them have been horrendously stereotyped. And there's no doubt whatsoever that Henry VIII did monstrous things and was arguably a psychopath from a certain point in his life. But what we both felt from what we read was that the part that is overlooked is the fact that he was a young, passionate man. Catherine was the love of his life. He wouldn't have married her otherwise. On paper, there were far better wives. He married her, and for 24 years they were together. And what sent him mad and destroyed their marriage was his desperate need and desire and quest for a son. And the more that they weren't able to have one, the more he became possessed with the fact that he thought God hated him. Because in the mindset of the time, if you are a king, God does not give you a son, it's because he hates you. He's judging you. He's punishing you because he doesn't approve of you. And that would have driven Henry absolutely mad. And that I think makes sense of the man he becomes. So I think what we wanted to do very much was sort of tell an origin story for both of them. You know, Catherine is not this cliche of the dumpy, unwanted first wife that she's painted as being, and Henry isn't just a psychopathic monster. They both had big journeys that took them there, and this very loving and passionate marriage for many years. So we wanted to tell that story.
Right. I think that that's something that, I mean, I guess when we learn the history of how many times he got married and she was the first wife, you don't realize 24 years.
Yeah.
That's like a lifetime for
Yeah.
a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's not like he just married her and got rid of her and then on to the next one. Like it was a real thing.
Yeah.
So my next question would be telling the stories of the women rather than the men, which is such a historical rarity, really makes you realize how much power the women have. And especially in this story, how much Catherine played a role in the success of, England. How much of an impact do you think that this story is having really on the way that we see history as we watch it? Just kind of realizing this isn't a man's story.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was a man's world, but women were. Catherine was held in very high regard, and when Henry left the country and went to France to fight, he made her regent, and he put her in charge of what was left of the army. He put her in charge of the country. And she properly ruled and proved herself.
And that was unprecedented.
That was unprecedented, as was Henry having the two of them crowned together, which was his way of saying, we're equals in this, we're running this thing together. So even though we don't know much about the conversations that Catherine and Henry had between themselves, because that stuff isn't chronicled, we do know that he held her in very high esteem. I mean, not just as his wife, but as a political player. And so I think that stuff is very, very good to bring to the screen, because not long after that, Henry is going to descend into being the character that we all sort of believe that we know, the man who seems to despise women. I think, truthfully, he did despise everyone who wasn't Catherine afterwards. He couldn't deal with them. He didn't know how to deal with them.
But also, I think it's very interesting that, as Matthew says, they start their journey as equals, and that's absolutely at Henry's behest. And Catherine proves herself time and time again. In season 1, we saw her be an ambassador. She was the first female ambassador. Yeah. We see that she goes to Flodden, and the truth of the matter is Flodden was a much bigger deal than the Battle of the Spurs, which Henry goes to. And history tells us that she made light of her own success, so she didn't hurt his ego. And all of this would have been fine if she hadn't, in their eyes, failed at the one function as a woman she was supposed to deliver. And so the story is very much a story about gender and power, because for Catherine, she loses that power and status and freedom because she is not being able to deliver this one thing that everybody wants from her. Of course, ironically, it's, if she can't make that happen, it was a genetic thing, we think, that happened between her and Henry. But she loses her power because of being female. So there's this really thorny story, I think, in this season now that is really that tussle about how do you retain your truth and your truthful identity as a woman, and for Catherine, who she was, and hold on to power and agency in her life.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I guess one thing that I guess we didn't also, another thing that I learned about watching this that I never realized is just how soap opera-y history really is. It's like you can do a whole dramatic soap opera out of a history book, and you guys did. Like, tell me about that. Like,
well, you know, it's all about, I mean, like, you're absolutely right, because life then was very melodramatic. It was very life and death. And so all the emotions are very heightened. I mean, most people were expected to die in their, you know, 30s. And if you lived beyond the age of 7, you know, you were expected to be healthy enough to survive into your 30s, and anything beyond 30 was a bonus. So it was a very immediate time. Everyone was very much embracing, grabbing moments, carpe diem every day, you know, just seize the moment, seize the moment. And that gives a certain, I know what you mean, a certain operatic quality to the stories.
But I think it's also true to say, absolutely, of course, we apply artistic license. And the reality of history is, yeah, I can't remember who famously said the problem with history is it's just one thing after another. History itself doesn't conform very well to a dramatic shape. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't have good payoffs. So what you have to do is you have to lean into the facts and mold them. And sometimes we conflate a time period, or sometimes we slightly fudge the order that something happened. So we're always, of course, first and foremost, we're dramatists, and we're trying to deliver entertainment and something that speaks to a 21st century audience. So we're definitely not slavish towards the history, and history sadly doesn't quite serve itself up in the form of a good drama. So we have to bring something too.